Okay, welcome everybody. It is the end of February, February 28th. It's Friday at 11 a.m. I'm Peter Antevi, and I'm joined by my co-host Tanner Smita. And this is another Florida EMS webinar where we bring the best and the brightest to the webinar. Most of the time, these are topics that you've haven't heard of before. They're very unique, and today is no different. I met Julia and Kim in California when I was in the CFED conference speaking, and I was fascinated by what they are doing. And I begged and pleaded for them to actually join the webinar, and they accepted. Um, so both Julia Afrasiabi and Kim Zaky are working at UCI Health, which is in California. They're program managers. So Kim is a program manager for the Burn Center, but she has 20 years of experience in EMS, pediatrics, and trauma. Julia has 18 years of EMS trauma and ER experience, and she's a pre-hospital care coordinator at UCI Health. And wait till you hear what they're doing. Many of you know that when you have a case in EMS, you bring it in, and you really have no idea what happens after that. They really put together a very unique debriefing process that I wanted all of you to hear about. So without any further ado, Kim and Julia, thanks for joining the Florida EMS webinar, and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. I'm Kim Zaky, and this is Julia. And we appreciate the opportunity to share how we developed and implemented a asynchronous debrief process from EMS through inpatient. So a little bit about why and then our why. We know that high stress and busy teams such as EMS and busy EDs do not routinely have the opportunity to debrief critical events. We do know that a lot of times if they do, it is very informal, it is not recorded, and sometimes that information does not get disseminated out to entire teams. We also know that without these debriefs and follow through, we could have decreased loop closures and leave open-ended problems without this tool. Traditionally, debriefs focus on review, but more and more information that is coming out shows that debrief sessions can lead to identifying education needs and system process changes. We also know that a debriefing tool can lead to increased patient safety by addressing process issues, knowledge gaps, and clinical skill improvements. So by implementing a consistent just culture debriefing process, leaders can create a non-judgmental forum that supports psychological safety and performance improvement. So this is my why, and you may seem baffled about why I'm hugging a wall. I do have over 20 years of pre-hospital ED trauma experience. I have spent basically all my life as a radio nurse working with EMS. I was given a once-in-a-career opportunity when I was at a Children's Comprehensive Center to open a PEDS-only base station. So with that came a lot of research, protocol building, and for our department, we would see 300 to 500 pediatric patients per day. That's how busy our ED was. Most of them came by private auto. Not a lot of our patients, especially PEDS patients, came by EMS. And when we started looking at the data, the county data, we realized that out of all of the EMS transports in our county, only 1% of the transported patients were pediatric patients. So that by default tells us that pediatric interactions are low volume. So not only are pediatric patients low volume, they also have very little pediatric education opportunities. So it was my goal, and what I committed to was making sure that I was able to provide a detailed outcome on every single base contacted call that came to us. I wanted to feed back this information. And I was surprised with some of the feedback that I got in response. And I'll list a couple of them. You know, thank you. I was very worried about this kid. So we have EMS providers who maybe brought in a febrile seizure that we see multiple times a day, but maybe that was their first time seeing a seizure patient. I've been a medic for over 10 years. This was the first time I have ever given epi for an allergic reaction. So again, low volume medication dosing. Thank you for sending good outcomes and not just the bad ones. And this to me reinforced how important it is to, give compliments to your assessment and intervention skills. And this by return increases confidence in the provider. So this whole process made me realize how important offering an opportunity to debrief and creating a just culture environment really was.
And then mine is a little more personal, not that hers was not personal, hers was very personal, but about 2 years ago, my brother, actually the week of CFED, Dr. Hantevi, got hit by a car. He was driving his motorcycle home from work one night and was hit by a car, and that's him in the middle, pre-accident. The picture on the right is him in the ICU a few days after his event. I remember when my mom called me thinking, okay, my first question for her is he dead? No, he's alive. Okay. Does he have a brain injury? No, his brain's fine. Okay, what about his spine? His spine is okay. Okay, what about his internal organs? There's no bleeding. Okay, so we're going to be okay. We can get through this, right? Like as a trauma nurse, you just go through the worst case scenarios and you run through it. And it was very strange and out of body to realize that things that we do every day can happen to us too. So really that wasn't where it clicked for me that this is something we needed in our system. It wasn't until a little later when he was finally up and walking and moving, which took a long time. It was 9-10 months later when he walked himself into the Berkeley Fire Department to meet the 2 medics who scraped him off the pavement. And when he walked in, I will keep the expletives out of their response, but what they said was, "Holy bleep, we thought you were dead. There's no way you should have survived that." So in their heads for 10 months, they had been processing scooping a 30-something-year-old young man off of the ground and that he died, when that was, 1, not the case at all. 2, their interventions saved his life. The medications they gave him in the field actually stopped his bleeding. And they never got any of that information until he walked in himself as a patient. So for me, that really made me realize how much of a gap we had in our pre-hospital and our system when it comes to loop closure and debriefing. So what we started talking about before we really got into the asynchronous, right? Like you got to spend a lot of time thinking about what you need to work on. And what we first looked at was burnout. Right? So those of us in this field know burnout is rampant, and we'll talk about data in a little bit about that. But burnout is not something to sniff at, and burnout is definitely not something that we wanted to ignore when we looked at pursuing this asynchronous idea. So we did a little research, and the first definition we found was that burnout is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by prolonged and excessive stress. Okay, that's literally every single pre-hospital staff member I've ever met in my life. We have prolonged excessive stress all the time, right? But this is the one that really caught our attention, was the World Health Organization calls it in burnout in our area, healthcare, they identify it as an occupational phenomenon, which is mind-blowing. And the result is chronic workplace stress that's not been successfully managed. And that's where we started to get the spidey tinglies of, okay, yes, we know it happens, we know it's a thing, but the real problem is it's not being taken care of at all.
So what does the research show? And I'm not going to belabor these statistics because it's something that we already know, is that there is burnout. This was pre-pandemic. So even before we kind of, put our system in more stress, 37% of pre-hospital and 40% of the hospital setting, we're just over it, fed up, burnout. Why? So in the pre-hospital setting, it was identified that it's the constant exposure and re-exposure to traumatic events, the long working hours, and the emotional demands of the job. In the hospital setting, it is increased patient acuity, inadequate staffing, and emotional demands. Also, it was noted in a study that, for the majority of EMS personnel, staff, they either are over it, like they are neutral on if they want to continue in this field, all the way to they strongly agree that they do not want to work in EMS anymore. And I'm sure this data is also outdated since this was 2023, but post-pandemic, the numbers are just going up with how burnt out everybody is in healthcare. 20% in EMS post-pandemic.
So when we saw all this data, we were thinking, okay, so we know burnout's a thing. We know it's only getting worse. Nothing's being done about it. I mean, the World Health Organization recognizes this. It's not just us 2 little nurses in a car driving around thinking about genius ideas, right? So what are we going to do about it? And this is where we kind of thought there could be a very direct relation between debriefs and combating burnout. But how do we do that when we're working in different settings, right? So we want the same thing. Part of the need is related to the full care of the patient. So why not look at the continuum of care? Why not look at from the moment a patient needs healthcare, i.e. calling 911 and needing pre-hospital, all the way through till their ICU stay, their acute 24, 48, 72, 92 hours is done, right? And that's kind of where our focus then was able to be pulled into focusing on. We jokingly laugh about this, that we called it a journey on the gurney, but it really is. It's when the patient hits that first need and then the wheeling of them all the way through all the care that they get provided. And the biggest thing we realized was, hold on, this is great. We want to address this whole continuum, but how are we going to do it when this continuum, the care teams are disparate, right? So these teams, the definition of disparate teams, I'm sure everybody knows this, but it's where there's a markedly distinct and made, and the groups are made up of different elements, meaning you have your paramedics, you have the crew that run on them, you have your trauma staff that cared for them, you have your burn ICU staff that took care of them, or the trauma ICU staff. And I think the biggest point to, I don't want to belabor, but really highlight is nobody's physically located together ever. They're never, unless it's at handoff, they're never in the same spot. So in order to actually get their input and get their thoughts and look at the system, it would take us 3 years to get one team together. So we really wanted to identify the areas we could focus on if we did start to want to focus on the disparate team. Some areas that we thought we could absolutely not just identify, but actually address were things like misconceptions during a debrief. They can be corrected. So you would think something, and then in your debrief, as you're talking, you realize, oh, wait, no, but maybe that's not what it actually was. Or maybe, oh, you're right, that is the correct dosing. I just second guessed myself. Secondarily, the validations of observations, I think, are huge. To Kim's point earlier, when she was talking about her why, you have no idea how many times we have medics come in and go, I don't know what it is, but there's something about this patient, or my gut was telling me something was wrong. And debriefing it can validate that, because you get the outcome. You're, oh, that's what was wrong. No wonder I thought something was off. It was hard to pinpoint, but I knew. And then lastly, we really wanted to focus on non-threatening. So we don't, back to that just culture mindset, we didn't want it to be as if we were debriefing because something needed to be educated to, or you made a mistake, right? So by focusing on these, it allowed us to really look at what we could build. And in that brainstorm time, we realized debriefing is not a one and done, ever. It is not okay, I did my one debrief with my team. For those of you on this call or on this video who have done debriefs, you know, things come up later, more questions occur, you have your hot debrief, you then wait a few weeks and you bring in, you know, an expert because some kid had a random disease process nobody knows about. And so you have a cold debrief about that, but it's never done. So we could very strategically fit ourselves into where it's never done. Let's be the first point of access for them to be able to provide their thoughts and give their feedback on a call. We definitely ran into and made assumptions, but we definitely ran into a lot of barriers. Biggest one is the lack of synchronization, not able to find anybody anytime. Everybody works different shifts. A shift is picking up a B shift call with a C shift guy who needs overtime for his vacation. It was a nightmare. The other thing we definitely ran into, especially, you know, in the pre-hospital setting, was that fear of admitting that there was the potential that things weren't done exactly how they should have been done. So that self-protective mechanism kicks in. There's also, you know, that mindset of what's the point? We talk about these and nothing changes. We bring this up all the time to our fill in the blanks and nothing gets better. So what's the point of even talking about these cases anymore? The other things we found, kind of to feed off of what I just said, though, was the scheduling. Getting people to sit down at a table at the same time was near impossible. The other part that we found was in a hospital setting, everybody needs breaks. This person's on a break and that person's not back yet. So before you know it, it's end of shift. So we were running into that problem in our hospital setting once they did reach our doors. And then the other one that we really felt pretty significantly was the facilitators were really difficult. You can't just have anybody run a debrief. Somebody just can't step in and be like, okay, we're gonna debrief, because that's not going, there are specific steps, and there's been a lot of research in how a well thought out debrief is run by a well trained facilitator. But arguably our biggest challenge was we're busy. I'm sure this looks nothing like how busy your ERs actually are, because this was a Google image. If I took a picture of our real ER right now, it would look like much worse. But then even more so, you guys are busy out in the field. Call volume is only exponentially increasing by the year. I just watch it tick up. So the busyness factor is hugely influential in whether patient or people who have had a call are going to be able to sit down and talk about it if they have to go to the next call. So our primary goals when we went into all of this was, we knew the future improvement relied on feedback from the staff who are doing this work. We knew research showed that debriefs help. We knew that there's been ad nauseum amounts of information out there on how it's beneficial, but nothing was being truly actively done consistently. So if we know it's going to help, why aren't we doing more? So we had to pivot. We had to adapt our mindset. So we decided, instead of trying to chase people down, we changed the forum that the debrief was provided in. And that's where asynchronous debriefing comes about. We wanted to provide a forum where the staff members who are involved in complex, high stakes cases had the opportunity to give their input, share what went well, acknowledge what could have gone better, acknowledge their colleagues. This was a big one. What colleagues did you work with that really did a great job? You'll see later on how absolutely positive that piece was. And we wanted it in real time. And what we figured was, if we could get pre-hospitals feedback and we could get the inpatient ICU feedback and we could get the ED trauma feedback, that little sweet spot in the middle of that Venn diagram is what we were calling the collaborative system improvement opportunity. Meaning if everybody could come together and provide good insight, we probably, hopefully, possibly could move towards improvement of our system from the perspective of the people who were working within it. Some considerations that we definitely want to point out, because moving forward, we're going to talk about our framework. This does not replace the in-person debriefs that pre-hospital does. This does not, take the place of your hot debriefs and your peer support and all of that. This does not replace your incident reporting. So if you as an institution or a pre-hospital have incident reporting, that is still in play. It did allow for comments to be done asynchronously throughout the entire stay of the patient. I will say, I want to highlight also, it did allow for anonymity. So the ability to be honest without your name assigned to it was shockingly freeing for some people. And then it did allow at the end for us to schedule an in-person sit down, go to your station, go to your unit debrief as well. So those are just some considerations that we tied along with it. And then just very quickly with our timeliness, we made sure that we get alerts every morning. Generally, we know before the 12-hour mark after an event has occurred, and we will within 20, I like to say sub 24 because I haven't hit 24 hours yet, fingers crossed, where we can send out the asynchronous QR code and the asynchronous link for the staff to start providing their feedback. Basically so that when they get a minute, they can finally get around to it. When they finally get a moment at 2 in the morning and their brain's running on it, they can put their thoughts down. It allowed for significant flexibility on everybody's part, including ours as the facilitators. We could plan ahead as to when we were going to sit down with them because we knew we had captured real-time information already. The information we gathered was so widespread, but really the stuff that we kind of put into buckets were things like the equipment use and needs, skill sets, Kudos, like I said, was a big one. Communication was another big one. You can imagine when you're looking at patients being handed off multiple times, and then processes and policies as well. It allowed us to really dive into those.
Okay, so let's just discuss the nuts and bolts of how we implemented this process. So of course we had to start with stakeholder buy-in. We had to ask, our directors and leaders, our medical directors, we have this idea, is this something that you will support so we can move through? So once we had the leadership buy-in, they also said you need to go to risk management. So we went through risk management to make sure that we were in compliance with being able to have this information submitted, and it's kept under the umbrella of PI. We then met with our pre-hospital and in-hospital stakeholders. So Julia went to the pre-hospital area to discuss with managers, fire chiefs, and I went through and talked with the teams, ED and the unit. HIPAA and other considerations, you need to be aware of your own PHI and your organization's expectations. We looked at discoverability. This was protected under our trauma and burn PI groups. And privacy, we de-identified for a systematic review, and also the ones that inputted information were anonymous. We couldn't pick everybody, so we wanted to start with a selective high-risk group. We did our burns. For our patient, 20% of our burn patients come by EMS. So the other 80% arrive by different means. So we thought this was still a low volume and very hands-on activity in the field with lots of interventions and a lot of movement. Those usually go straight through the ED, red line to OR or to the unit. Traumatic full arrests, those are really heavy working calls. Anything pediatric, but specifically critical pediatric traumas, those are stressful for everybody involved, and precipitous deliveries because that is high risk, low volume, lots of skill sets. So we created QR codes. We have the pre-hospital that Julia pushes out. We have the ER trauma debrief and the burn debrief. So they get sent to different locations. We get triggered either by the trauma page that goes out, we get pages for burn, we run a 24-hour report, but honestly, I feel staff call us right away or text us. So we either send out the QR code or link to the form. We look to see who is on shift. It's important to see who's on because we get a lot of rotating students. So we want students, liaisons, residents all included to be able to provide feedback. So this is an example of pre-hospital. It is matched up using an incident number. There's no patient identifiers other than that. We started with just the 4 local agencies that come to us most often. It is sent through their elite PCR system or email, and then we sent magnets to the fire stations to have if they wanted to send it later on. We created badge buddies for staff, and also, again, we send it out through our Volt messaging system and through the emails. And then there's a burn debrief as well. And what that looks like is we are able to capture the MRN of the patient because you are required to have a university email in order to log in, but it still keeps you anonymous. So we don't collect the names and emails. It's just to get you through that first pass of security. So let's see it at work. We had a very significant burn patient come in. We were aware of this case because it was just such a devastating injury. We were able to send off links to the pre-hospital, ED, and then I send it up to the unit as anticipation that you're going to get this patient. So again, this was sent out. Everybody had it within 24 hours. The pre-hospital, a total of 4, provided responses. And then we continued to get responses throughout the patient's stay. And there was a in-person debrief requested. So the crew, the EMS crew said, we really want to debrief in person. So these are the kind of comments that we get. What could have been handled differently? The pre-hospital personnel said, honestly, I feel like it went pretty well. I could have given a smoother radio package with the details being more organized and less sporadic. Nothing. I thought the receiving team at the hospital did an outstanding job listening to reports and acting quickly. So a follow-up for us would be like, oh, let me go talk to the radio nurse who handled that call. And that radio nurse was like, no, he did a great job. What a very complicated case. Like, kudos to him. So we're pulling out these positive reinforcements so we can feed it back. ED said, nothing. The burn team was at bedside when the patient arrived. They appreciated that. We fed that back up to the burn unit. ICU. Maintenance rate was not reached at the 24-hour mark. Our protocol was not clear on how to continue. Needed to meet with MD on next steps. So what do you think we did with this? We needed to do a process change. So we looked at our policy and we were able to put verbiage to say, hey, if you hit the 24-hour mark, your next step is XYZ because we don't want this happening again. So we're looking at process changes. What was done well? Pre-hospital, we worked well together to extinguish the patient and prioritize all working parts. Patient was transported quickly from trauma bay to inpatient, initiating fluids and resuscitation was good. And the ICU said great communication. This was the staff nurse's first resuscitation. She did a great job. So we sent that to her manager to say, hey, kudos on a job well done. This was a very stressful situation. And then I'm telling you, since we implemented this, majority are kudos. So I feel when I'm sending off an email, do you ever think like, oh, if they see my email, they're going to cringe. It's something bad. Our emails, are generally associated with something good, that they get a kudos and a job well done. Doctor in charge came in, with the patient calm, the staff were ready. They listened to report. The MICN was able to get us an outside hospital for airway management, which would have been a bad situation. New grad perspective. I was assigned a backup. This was my first fluid resuscitation. So a lot of kudos that I think when the staff hear that, that makes your day a little bit better. That reinforces that I am doing a good job. It is not just about hearing all the bad or not meeting the metrics or, whatnot. So the EMS wanted a debrief and we scheduled it and we were able to go out and already bring this feedback back to them and close the loops, which, again, makes this back and forth that much more succinct and that much more focused.
And then just really quickly to tie everything together, you kind of have seen how we go about the process, our framework. But now, now what do you do with all the information you've obtained? You get all this info and what do you do with it? You don't want to just sit on info. So some things that we were able to do in the last 2 years with this process is we've been able to bring solutions to the table about processes and policies that maybe need to be updated. We've been able to schedule multiple debriefs with multiple different specialties. We've identified PI opportunities, so actual system-wide PI opportunities have come up, and we've been able to support a just culture. We've identified that that's very important, and this is not punitive. We need to look at it from the system, and we can't do it if we don't have everybody's input. Some other things that we did find, we found that it was a really good platform to facilitate discussion. Some of the things that were put in the bulk of their responses really garnered some very good one-on-one, or not one-on-one, but like debrief conversations when they did request us to sit down. We've been able to influence education. We've looked at system improvement. I would say the big one, having talked to a lot of these pre-hospital personnel, is the ability to self-debrief before they have to sit down and talk about something was surprisingly positive for them. Being able to put it down so that then they can articulate their thoughts and it's not jumbled in their head. It helps them organize things. I know we've hit our time mark, but we did provide 3 QR codes here for everybody. If anybody wants to scan those, these are basically the meat and potato cornerstones of the framework that we used. So how to build a Microsoft form. That's what we use for the actual debrief that we send out. How to do QR codes, how to link your forms to QR codes. And then we use Teams. We use it for our PI and tracking purposes. And this is just a video to kind of show how we do some of that if you're interested. And then our references are next. But that is the brief overview of a lot of hard work that we've put into trying to reshape how debriefs can happen for these patients and these staff members.
Wow. Fantastic presentation, Kim and Julia. And I know there's probably a lot of people who want to have questions, and we will go just a few minutes and then we'll get to Dr. Pepe's webinar shortly. But I don't know if anyone watches that new ER show, The Pit. You guys watching that? Yeah. And so I don't know if you saw last night's episode, but Noah Wiley was trying to debrief after a death, and he was getting into his rhythm. He was getting all personal. He had probably 15 people in the room. And then he gets interrupted because people are punching each other in the waiting room.
Yeah.
And he's like mid emotion. And then he's like, okay. And he literally walks out deflated. And that's to me summarized probably every interaction that happens after a critical call in the ER. I mean, at least he took the time to take 30 seconds to check in with everybody.
Yeah.
But many of you know that for all of us who've been doing this for a long time, not just in EMS, in the ER, but in EMS specifically. The other comment I'll make is that they say that the best specialty for feedback is anesthesia, right? You turn the dial, the patient goes out, you turn the dial the other way, they wake up. The worst specialty for feedback is EMS, and for all the reasons that you talked about, right? We think the patient has one thing, or Julia, to your brother, they thought your brother had died, and so that closure and what you guys have accomplished, it's some people would think of it as a soft. This is soft, right? It's not so sexy, if you will, but it's so important. And for those of us who are older, who've been doing this for quite a while, like you all have done, I think we end up seeing what happens when you don't have the full loop closure that you guys are doing. So kudos to you for doing that. Let me bring in Tanner, my co-host. So Tanner, you're a paramedic. You are a medical student, right? So you're kind of early in your career. What are your comments on Kim and Julia's presentation?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and again, thank you very much for the presentation. So I had two comments to make. So one based on the scientific literature that's out there, and then the other one based on kind of personal experience and how it's done locally in one of our EMS systems in West Virginia. So whenever I saw that you were coming on, kind of in preparing for this, I went to the Pre-Hospital Emergency Care Journal and I typed in some of the keywords, right? CISM, CISD, debrief. And I looked at what had been published in kind of our field's journal over the last 20 or 30 years. And I only really found one paper that specifically addressed how this was being deployed and some of the evidence surrounding effectiveness of these sorts of procedures in the pre-hospital setting, written by Brian Bledsoe in 2003. So it's been a while since this has been discussed and studied. And at that point in time, so he did a pretty thorough literature review. He looked at everything that was out there, even meta-analyses of multiple randomized controlled trials, looking at firefighters, police officers, EMS clinicians, even some kind of military personnel. And kind of the take-home message of his paper was that there's no high-quality evidence that suggests that this actually works to decrease PTSD, symptoms of psychological distress out there in the literature, and even some literature that suggests that it could actually be harmful when done in certain ways for certain groups of providers. And again, there's wide variation in how this is done. There's different models that are cited. Again, it's done in wide varieties of different people. And so it's hard to actually tie that back to the effectiveness in EMS and how we should actually be doing it for our clinicians. I just found that was an interesting finding, especially in contrast to kind of my personal experience with providing these debriefs to clinicians. And so, and now nowhere I've worked or nowhere that I've been involved with has had such a formalized and organized system like the one that you presented here. But what I've observed is that providers do have a hunger for these sorts of debriefs, and that the medical directors at our agency, as they've kind of set up systems to allow providers to request feedback and request debriefs, they get a flood of requests, and they set up Zoom meetings, and they get people attending following these critical calls like the ones that you described, right? Especially pediatric patients, traumatic arrest, things like that. And I think people do anecdotally experience, closure from understanding the outcomes of patients, having the medical director sit down with you and say, you did a great job. You are an asset to this organization. We see what you're doing. We appreciate it. And so, just overall, I think that we as a field, need to actually study this and need to actually, in a formalized, systematic way, determine how can we do this to take care of our providers, to mitigate the burnout and the mental health crisis that's, being observed in EMS across the country. So yeah, those are the comments I have. Thanks again for presenting.
Yeah.
Kim and Julia, now you know why I bring Tanner to this meeting. Seems great comment. And Tanner, it's funny you say that. I'll go to Brett here in a minute. I see you want to raise your hand, but you are exactly right in that the old data, I think it's conflicting, and I don't think it's true. Like it's obviously not true, right? Like doing nothing is not better than doing something. And so 2003, I'm not sure, were you born yet by that time? I don't know. Yeah, you were probably
I was
born.
born in 2001, so I
Oh,
just
okay.
just made it.
Okay, so just a baby. Awesome. So we have a lot of comments here. I wasn't sure if Brett wanted to come in, but let's bring in Ben Maza. Debriefing is specialized a skill. How did you choose your debriefers?
Yeah, I would say, to some points that I made, your debriefer is going to make or break you. We don't want someone coming in that, focuses on the negative. So we really, if there was something specific within the case, that's not something we would talk in the forum. Like if it's something that needs to be handled within the purview of EMS and their captain, chief, and that reporting line. We really wanted to focus on systems changes. So making sure that we were very mindful on how we fed this back, because once that door closes, it's very difficult to kind of get back in. I think I had a huge learning curve when I opened the PED space and providing that information. And just anecdotally, what I found is if I'm giving a follow-up on every single patient, the majority are going to be positive, right? So if that team opens up and there was opportunity for improvement, they're going to take it with, hey, I had 10 good outcomes and one where we can learn something. I think that one is a feel good, and two, they're more receptive to looking at possible ways to, improve patient care.
And to your point, both Kim and I have been trained in how to run debriefs. We don't just send any of our staff out. It's one of us who are involved actively in every single one of them. We don't need people learning.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Exactly.
That's not helpful.
That great question. Great comment. I'm gonna pick on somebody here. Joseph Zalkin. Joseph, you ran a very large agency, Wake EMS in North Carolina, for many years. You've seen it all. You've been there. You've done it all. What are your comments here for those of us who are, kind of doing the same thing and trying to learn from Kim and Julia?
It was an impressive presentation. Thank you for that. Peter, I remember half of what I've done, but that's okay. I think debriefing is important in our industry. It is maybe a matter of terminology I put in the chat that fire service, for example, does a hot wash after a major fire, where they basically gather people together, say what went right, what went wrong, as a immediate feedback, short, sweet, identify the hot spots. I think you dig down into a major incident, there's an incident review, and that's a much more formal debrief, quote unquote. I know that there was a time when American Heart had a subsection on debriefing post cardiac arrest. So if you deal with an incident specific type where folks can say from their role what they saw, what went right, what went wrong, what needs to be improved. But what I'm hearing collectively, there's a whole mental health trigger piece. And even in the series that Peter mentioned, they do check in with each other. Some systems like the Wake system, for example, encourages the supervisors to interact with the crews that are on pediatric cardiac arrest if they weren't on scene, just to check in with those folks. As we all know, there's nothing worse than having a horrific event at the beginning of a shift. And then their ability to process, as this TV series showed in the second episode, their ability to think through and process information and be kind to others. And the subconscious was affecting their capability to perform. And I do think we do get exposed to stuff that gets pushed down over time. And then there are small triggers where everything comes out. I think it's important. I think it's a part of a process. I think that process has a lot of different turns to it.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that your comments, and then combine that with Tanner throwing in an article from 2003 that we're still not doing this effectively, and Kim and Julia, that you're exposing us to something that, like Mike Humphrey from Canada said, it's genius. Like how could no one ever thought about it? And the reason is because no one sees EMS into the hospital as a continuum, right? We'll have quarterly meetings and we'll talk about, whatever, some data metrics, but no one's ever looking at it on a case by case basis. And I think that's what has to change. You all have developed a mechanism with a QR code, which is brilliant. I just wish that there would be some way of opening up a chat, if you will, like almost like a WhatsApp chat, and saying, hey, everybody can put their comments in about that one case, keep it protected, which is hard to do. Like that has to be certain type of software that you have to build for that. So let me bring in as our last guest, and then I'll give him and Julia the last word. But Mike, I know you do a lot of work. You guys are just very impressive up in Lethbridge, what you do with cardiac arrest. I'd love to hear your comment.
Yeah, thank you. Terrific presentation. That's awesome. I don't know why we haven't thought of something like that. But one thing that we've been doing is we created a sub account for our ICU docs to go in, and they can actually look at physiological states of the patient when they were in their living room. And the fallout of that is that not only is the ICU getting a good picture of what actually happened on scene, but then we're getting that clinical follow-up. And then we're able to filter that back to our paramedics that are actually on the call. So, prime example is a septic patient who is hypotensive. They gave a bunch of fluid and got some pressors, and then we're able to get the follow-up of that septic patient when they got to the ICU, what happened. And so I think when the more information flow back and forth, the better you're going to get with information and following patients through hospital and getting that feedback to paramedics.
That's actually a great point, because I wanted to mention, I'll get to Charlie here in a second, that we in Broward implemented the ESO health data exchange. Huge. It was a huge thing because the medic can get they're not talking to anybody, but they could see what happened to their patient. So I think that's brilliant what you guys did there. So Dr. Charlie Ingram, my associate medical director here in Broward. Charlie, what's up? What do you got?
Yeah, so I did this extensively at Yale, not quite to this depth level, but it takes like a special person to start it, right? And so like the two of you are doing incredible stuff and took it to a whole nother level of like tech and like organization. But the way I started it for like some of the like early people that are on this, a way I started at Yale is I created a notification system that just emailed me every time that there was an R room activation. So like if they were in a recess bay, then like, and they came from EMS, like I got an email about it. And like, if there was a pediatric code, I got an email about it. And like, it became a lot of just me having all of the cell phone numbers of all of my chiefs and all of my like managers and the EMS supervisor. And like, they called it AMR 50 was their like EMS supervisor on the road. And I was like, hey, when is this person working and where are they today? And send them to my office so that we can just like chat about this terrible thing that happened. And so you just do it that way for so long that like it develops into something bigger, right? And so like the health data exchange, the HDE piece of ESO that we have down here is great. And I had a massive piece of it at Yale as well. But it's not enough, unfortunately, right? Like the departments are so worried about releasing information to their medics and stuff that like, and then trying to translate like CT reports and labs into something useful. It just doesn't make sense, right? And so like you need somebody to translate that ER note to a one-liner of like, this is what happened to that.
Yes, exactly.
Like it is crazy. One of my medics, who's a good friend of mine from New Haven, he saved a guy that got hit on a motorcycle, similar to your story. It happened to happen right in front of their firehouse. He didn't know that guy was alive until he saw him at the bar, like giving a talk about like being alive after trauma, right? Like that's wrong. Like we should always know. And so like I've pushed our local hospitals here, like within the last few days, even to be like, hey, your ESO health data exchange is not good enough. You have to push ER notes. You have to push CT results so that I can translate them for our guys. So, but yeah, it's a team effort for sure. So, but yeah.
And to your point, I think it's important to recognize the value of interpersonal relationships with something like this. You're rolling this kind of thing out. You're asking a lot of people who do things very different to try to do something the same way. And it's really about the FaceTime that you spend. Before Kim and I have spent a lot of FaceTime building trust with a lot of people so that they trust that what they put into that thing is not just anonymous, but protected.
Yeah, you have to psychological safety. It's not something that is given. So
you have to create just culture before you can do that.
Yes.
Right. And like,
Yes.
I knew that I like figured that out, and I got that the first time I got a phone call of like, hey, I made a tenfold dose error on a pediatric patient. I was boarding a plane, and one of my medics was like, hey, I just want to make you aware of this before you see it.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm on vacation for a week, but thank you. And I was like, keep working. We'll talk
You get
about it
more
when I get home.
self-reporting,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah,
that
that's
consistency
interesting.
that you need, because they know that what they feed you is going to be dealt with in a sensitive and delicate way, right?
Yes. Yes. Well, now everyone understands why I begged Kim and Julia to come on this program. Hopefully, this spawned a lot of new ideas. I think Tanner brought up the fact that we need research in this area in a bad way and not just rely on what the old data has shown us. And thank you so much for this amazing presentation. Let me give you all the last word. You know, you're talking to people from around the country, and even into Canada. What would be your recommendation? Like first step, next step, how to really do what you're doing? Give us your final words, and then we'll take it away.
My final word would just be, don't be afraid to try it. This did not, it took adjusting in time, but we're also available. So please don't recreate a wheel that we have already worked through. So we don't have our contact information up on the screen, but Dr. Antevi has it. Feel free to reach out to either one of us. We are available to brainstorm, provide insight, anything that you're interested in. We are very passionate about this. So it's beneficial for us to promote it across whoever needs it.
I think my take home would be, if you don't know about Just Culture, read up on Just Culture and learn the best ways to create a safe environment for transparency and create an environment that promotes patient satisfaction, patient safety, and also, provider satisfaction and job satisfaction.
And I think I'm going to end with the fact that Charlie said something very unique, which hit me, which is you have to be a special person to do this. And you two are very special. The folks at UCI are very blessed to have you, the patients, the providers, etc. So we appreciate it. For everyone on the webinar, thank you for joining us. Myself and Tanner, we appreciate you guys. If you go up into the chat, there's a link to the webinar for Dr. Pepe's webinar. And I'll put that right back in here as well. For everyone on LinkedIn, appreciate you guys joining us. And we'll put this up on YouTube as well, Kim and Julia, and I'll send you the link once that's up. All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you.